Story 1. The Mirror Highway. Jake Morrison had been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the American highway system had to offer. He'd driven through blizzards in Montana, dust storms in Arizona, and fog so thick in Oregon that he could barely see his own hood. But nothing in those 2 decades prepared him for what happened on Interstate 80 through Nebraska on November 14th, 2019. He'd picked up a load of agricultural equipment in Des Moines, bound for Cheyenne. It was supposed to be a straightforward run, the kind he could do in his sleep. The weather forecast was clear, no construction delays reported, and he'd timed it perfectly to avoid the worst of the traffic. Jake pulled out of the depot at 6:47 p.m., his GPS showing an estimated arrival time of 4:23 a.m. He settled into his seat, adjusted his mirrors, and merged onto the interstate as the last fingers of daylight withdrew from the November sky. The first 3 hours were exactly what he expected. He passed through the outskirts of Omaha around 9:15 p.m., grabbed a coffee at a truck stop near exit 432, and chatted briefly with another driver about the upcoming Thanksgiving rush. The CB radio crackled with the usual banter, weather updates, and warnings about speed traps. Jake felt that familiar rhythm of the road, the meditative hum of tires on asphalt, the gentle sway of the cab as he navigated the gentle curves of the interstate. Around 10:30 p.m., somewhere between Lincoln and Grand Island, Jake noticed the traffic had thinned out considerably. That wasn't unusual for a weeknight in rural Nebraska, but what struck him as odd was that he hadn't seen another vehicle, not even in the distance, for nearly 20 minutes. The highway stretched before him like a dark ribbon, his headlights carving a tunnel through the absolute blackness of the prairie night. No farmhouse lights dotted the horizon. No distant glow from towns broke the darkness. Just empty road and endless night. He reached for his CB radio. "This is Big Jake on I-80 westbound. Anybody out there got their ears on?" Static answered him. He tried again. "Any drivers on 80 West? This is Big Jake at mile marker 312, looking for a radio check." More static, but this time it seemed to pulse with an odd rhythm, almost like breathing. Jake frowned and switched channels, but every frequency gave him the same result. His cell phone showed no signal. That wasn't entirely surprising. There were dead zones all through rural Nebraska. But the timing felt wrong. He'd made this run dozens of times, and usually had at least intermittent coverage through this stretch. Jake glanced at his GPS. The screen showed his location clearly enough. A blue dot moving steadily along the red line of I-80. But something about it nagged at him. He looked closer and felt a chill run down his spine. According to the GPS, he was at mile marker 312. But he'd just passed mile marker 312 20 minutes ago. Distinctly remembered it because there was a memorial sign next to it. One of those white crosses that mark where someone died in an accident. He'd noticed it and thought, as he always did when he saw those markers, about the fragility of life and the dangers of his profession. Jake shook his head, figuring the GPS had glitched. It happened sometimes, especially with older units like his. He'd just navigate by the mile markers themselves. He focused on the road ahead, watching for the next green sign. 5 minutes later, he saw it emerge from the darkness. Mile marker 312. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. That wasn't possible. He'd been maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour. Even if he'd somehow gotten turned around, which was impossible on a straight interstate with no exits. He should have been at marker 330 by now, not back at 312. Jake slowed down, his mind racing through possible explanations. GPS malfunction, sure, but the physical mile markers couldn't lie. He passed the memorial cross again, the same white cross, the same faded plastic flowers, the same name he couldn't quite make out in the darkness. Jake's mouth went dry. He grabbed his logbook and checked his odometer. It showed that he'd driven 187 miles since leaving Des Moines. The math was right. The odometer was working. But somehow, he was passing the same stretch of highway again. The next 20 minutes became a nightmare of repetition. Mile marker 312 appeared again and again, each time after what should have been 10 to 15 miles of driving. The white cross became a mocking presence, a signpost of his impossible situation. Jake tried speeding up to 85 miles per hour, hoping somehow to break through whatever was happening. The mile marker still appeared at the same interval. He tried slowing down to 40 miles per hour. The result was identical. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. That was wrong. He should have burned through at least 1/8 of a tank by now, maybe more with the acceleration and deceleration he'd been doing. But the needle hadn't moved. Jake's breathing became shallow, his palms sweaty despite the cool air from the vents. This wasn't a GPS error or a navigation mistake. This was something else entirely. Something that violated every natural law he understood. He decided to stop. Maybe if he just pulled over, turned off the engine, and restarted everything, it would reset whatever cosmic glitch was happening. Jake eased his rig onto the shoulder, the rumble strips thrumming under his tires, and brought the truck to a complete stop. He put it in park, engaged the air brakes, and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and his own ragged breathing. Jake climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The night air was cold, much colder than it should have been for mid-November. His breath fogged in front of his face. He walked around his truck, checking the tires, the trailer, anything to ground himself in physical reality. Everything looked normal. The agricultural equipment in his trailer was secure. The lights on his rig functioned properly, and the road beneath his feet was solid asphalt. But when he looked out at the darkness surrounding him, he felt a deep, primal wrongness. The prairie should have had some ambient light, some trace of civilization. Instead, the darkness was absolute and seemed to press against him like a living thing. The stars overhead were wrong too, not missing, but arranged in patterns he didn't recognize. Constellations that should have been there, the Big Dipper, Orion, were absent or twisted into unfamiliar shapes. A sound broke the silence, a long, low note that might have been a horn in the distance, but it didn't sound like any truck horn Jake had ever heard. It had a mournful, hollow quality that made his skin crawl. He hurried back to his cab and climbed inside, locking the doors with trembling hands. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He had to keep moving. Stopping felt dangerous, like staying in one place would allow the wrongness to seep into his truck and claim him. Jake pulled back onto the highway and accelerated to 65 miles per hour. His eyes fixed on the road ahead, searching desperately for any change, any sign that he was making progress. 10 minutes later, mile marker 312 appeared again. The white cross, the faded flowers. But this time, there was something else. A figure stood next to the memorial, illuminated by his headlights. It was a woman in a long dress that might have been white or pale blue. It was hard to tell in the harsh glare of his headlights. She stood perfectly still, facing the highway, and as Jake's truck approached, she raised one arm and pointed directly at him. He couldn't see her face clearly, but he had the distinct impression that she was smiling. Jake's blood turned to ice. He gripped the wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white, and kept his foot steady on the accelerator. He told himself not to look in his mirrors, but he couldn't help himself. As the figure receded behind him, he glanced at his driver's side mirror. The woman was still there, still pointing, but now she was closer to the road than she had been. Impossibly closer, as if she'd moved dozens of feet in the second it took him to pass. The next time he approached mile marker 312, the woman was standing on the shoulder of the road. The time after that, she was on the white line at the edge of his lane. Each repetition brought her closer to the center of the highway. Jake's mind was fracturing, caught between the need to understand what was happening and the growing certainty that understanding would break him completely. He started talking to himself, a rambling commentary meant to anchor his sanity. Okay, Jake, think. You're in a loop. Some kind of spatial anomaly, like in those science fiction movies. There's got to be a way out. Maybe you need to do something different. Take an exit. But there haven't been any exits. No exits since this started. No other cars either. Just you and the road, and that thing pretending to be a woman. The woman was now standing in the middle of his lane. Jake's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Every instinct screamed at him to slow down, to avoid hitting her, but a deeper, more primitive instinct told him that stopping was exactly what she wanted. He pressed down on the accelerator instead, pushing his rig to 75 miles per hour. The woman grew larger in his windshield, and he could finally see her face. It wasn't a face at all. Where her features should have been, there was just smooth, blank skin, like an unfinished mannequin. But he could still sense her smiling, could feel her terrible joy radiating through the glass. Jake closed his eyes and braced for impact. The truck shuddered as it passed through the spot where she stood, but there was no collision, no thump of a body hitting his grill. Just a wave of cold that penetrated the cab despite the heater running full blast. When he opened his eyes, the world had changed. Mile marker 313 appeared ahead of him, then 314, then 315. The loop was broken. Jake let out a sob of relief and kept driving, afraid that slowing down or celebrating would somehow trap him again. The mile markers continued their proper progression. At marker 320 he saw lights in the distance, the blessed glow of a truck stop. Other vehicles appeared on the road, their taillights like beacons of normalcy. Jake pulled into the truck stop at marker 325 and parked. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn off the engine. He checked his phone. 11:47 p.m. Less than an hour and a half had passed since he'd entered the loop, but it had felt like an eternity. He had signal again, 5 bars. His GPS showed him at the correct location. His fuel gauge had dropped to just over half a tank, appropriate for the distance he'd traveled. He stumbled into the truck stop diner and ordered coffee. The waitress, a woman named Donna according to her name tag, gave him a concerned look. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled cough. "Something like that," he managed. "Rough night on the road." He wanted to tell someone, to share the impossible thing that had happened to him. But who would believe it? He wasn't even sure he believed it himself. Maybe it had been a hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning, or a stroke, or sheer exhaustion. But his logs showed continuous driving. His odometer showed the miles. And deep in his gut, he knew it had been real. Jake finished his coffee and forced himself back into his truck. He had a delivery to make. The rest of the drive to Cheyenne was uneventful, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the road was watching him, waiting for another opportunity. He made his delivery at 6:15 a.m., more than an hour behind schedule, but alive and with his sanity mostly intact. He never drove through that stretch of I-80 at night again. He rerouted his runs to avoid it, even when it cost him time and money. Other drivers thought he was being superstitious, and he let them think that. It was better than trying to explain the truth. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd search online for other reports of strange happenings on I-80 through Nebraska. He found a few stories, vague accounts of time distortions and missing miles, but nothing that quite matched his experience. 3 months after his encounter, Jake was having a beer with another driver, a grizzled veteran named Ray, who'd been on the road for 30 years. Ray mentioned that he avoided a certain stretch of Nebraska highway, somewhere around mile marker 312. When Jake pressed him for details, Ray just shook his head and said, "Some roads don't like to let you go. That's all you need to know." Jake never told him about the woman with no face or the loop he'd been trapped in, but he understood, in a way only other drivers could, that the highway held secrets. Most of the time, it was content to let you pass through, just another traveler on an ancient ribbon of asphalt. But sometimes, for reasons no one understood, the road showed you things that weren't meant to be seen. And if you were lucky, it let you leave with your life and your mind, even if both were forever changed. Story 2. The Phantom Convoy. Marcus Chen had been hauling freight for the Pacific Transport Company for 17 years when he took the overnight run from Portland to Boise on February 8th, 2021. It was a route he'd driven hundreds of times, mostly through the night to avoid traffic and make the delivery window. His load was standard, pallets of electronics destined for a regional distribution center, nothing unusual or particularly valuable. The weather was clear, his truck was running perfectly, and Marcus was in good spirits as he pulled out of the depot at 10:23 p.m. The first leg of the journey took him through the Columbia River Gorge, a stretch of highway that Marcus actually enjoyed despite the late hour. The way the moonlight reflected off the river, the towering cliffs on either side, it had a stark beauty that never got old. He had his playlist going, a mix of classic rock and country, and he was making excellent time. By midnight, he was approaching the turnoff toward Highway 84, right on schedule. That's when he first noticed the lights in his mirror. 3 sets of headlights, spaced evenly apart, moving in perfect formation, about a quarter mile behind him. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't uncommon for trucks to travel in informal convoys, especially on long overnight hauls. The company was comforting, and drivers often matched speeds to stay together through the dark hours. But something about these trucks bothered him. They maintained an exact distance behind him, never gaining or falling back, even when Marcus adjusted his speed. He slowed to 60 miles per hour to let them pass. They slowed to 60. He accelerated to 70 They matched him perfectly. It was too precise, almost mechanical. Marcus had been in plenty of convoys before, and there was always some variation. Trucks would drift closer or fall back, depending on the terrain and their loads. He grabbed his CB radio. "This is Mountain Tiger, on 84 eastbound, calling the convoy behind me at mile marker 67. You guys got your ears on." Static answered him, but with an odd undertone, a rhythmic pulse that almost sounded like Morse code. Marcus tried again. "Any drivers behind me at marker 67? This is Mountain Tiger looking for a radio check." Nothing but that strange, pulsing static. Marcus checked his mirrors again. The 3 trucks were still there, maintaining their precise formation. In the glow of his taillights, he could make out their shapes. They were older models, probably from the 1970s or early 1980s, the kind with the long hoods and chrome grills. You didn't see trucks like that much anymore, especially not working commercial runs. Most had been retired years ago, replaced by more efficient modern rigs. A chill ran through him, despite the warmth of the cab. Marcus had heard stories from old-timers about phantom trucks, ghost vehicles that appeared on certain highways, usually as omens of bad things to come. He'd always dismissed those stories as superstition and campfire tales, the kind of folklore that develops in any profession where people spend long hours alone in the dark. But now, watching those 3 antique trucks hold their impossible formation behind him, he wasn't so sure. He decided to take an exit and let them pass. At mile marker 73, there was a rest area he'd used many times before. Marcus signaled and began to slow down, watching his mirrors to see what the convoy would do. The 3 trucks slowed with him, matching his deceleration exactly. When he pulled onto the exit ramp, they followed. When he turned into the rest area parking lot, they turned with him. Marcus's heart was pounding now. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal convoy behavior. He parked his rig in one of the designated truck spots and watched as the 3 trucks pulled into spots directly across from him, their headlights pointed straight at his cab. The lights were blinding, much brighter than they should have been, and they had a slightly blue tint that modern halogen or LED lights didn't have. He sat there for a full minute, his hand on the door handle, debating whether to get out. Through the glare of the headlights, he couldn't see if there were drivers in those trucks. The rest area was otherwise empty, which wasn't unusual for 1 a.m. on a Monday night, but it made Marcus feel exposed and vulnerable. Finally, he decided he was being paranoid. Maybe these guys were just old-school drivers with restored vintage trucks who thought it was funny to mess with him. Marcus opened his door and climbed down from his cab. The cold February air hit him, carrying with it a smell that made him pause. It was the smell of old diesel, the kind that older engines produced, thick and acrid. But there was something else underneath it, something that reminded him of standing water and rust and decay. He walked toward the 3 trucks, his boots crunching on the gravel, intending to introduce himself and ask them what the hell they thought they were doing. As he got closer, details emerged from behind the glare of the headlights. The trucks were in poor condition, much worse than he'd initially thought. The chrome grills were pitted with rust. The paint was faded and peeling. The windshields were covered in a film of grime so thick he still couldn't see inside the cabs. These weren't restored classics. These were derelict vehicles that shouldn't have been on the road at all. Marcus approached the first truck and knocked on the driver's side door. "Hey, driver, you want to tell me why you've been following me?" No response. He knocked harder. "Come on, this isn't funny. You've been on my tail for 30 miles. Still nothing. He tried the door handle. It was locked, but through the filthy window, he could just make out the shape of someone sitting in the driver's seat. The figure didn't move. It sat with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Marcus's sense of wrongness intensified. He moved to the second truck and then the third, and each time he found the same thing. A motionless figure behind the wheel, hands at 10 and 2, staring forward with inhuman stillness. No response to his knocking or his shouts. He backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Marcus turned and ran back to his truck, fumbling with the door and pulling himself inside. He locked the doors and grabbed his cell phone to call 911, but there was no signal. The phone showed full bars, but when he tried to dial, it immediately failed. His CB radio was still producing that strange, pulsing static. Marcus turned the key, and his engine roared to life. He had to get out of here. He didn't care about the delivery schedule or what his dispatcher would say. He just needed to be away from those 3 trucks and their silent, unmoving drivers. He put his rig in gear and began to pull forward, his tires kicking up gravel. In his mirrors, he saw the 3 trucks come to life simultaneously. Their engines started without any visible movement from the figures in the cabs. Their headlights brightened, and they began to move, pulling out of their parking spots with perfect synchronization. Marcus floored the accelerator, racing through the rest area and back toward the highway entrance. The Phantom convoy followed. They stayed right behind him as he merged back onto Highway 84, maintaining that exact quarter-mile distance. Marcus pushed his truck as hard as he dared, hitting 85 miles per hour on the straight stretches. The convoy matched him. He tried weaving between lanes, hoping to force them into a different pattern, or maybe cause them to fall back. They shifted with him, maintaining their formation as if connected by invisible wires. His mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. What if he called the highway patrol? But his phone wasn't working, and he had a feeling that even if he could call them, they wouldn't see anything wrong. What if he stopped again? The thought of those motionless figures in their derelict trucks made his stomach turn. He kept driving. Around 2:30 a.m., Marcus saw something ahead that filled him with hope. Red and blue lights were flashing on the shoulder. An accident scene with multiple police vehicles and what looked like an ambulance. There were real people there. Normal people dealing with a normal emergency. Marcus began to slow down, intending to pull over and explain his situation to the officers. Surely the presence of police would drive away whatever was following him. But as he drew closer to the accident scene, something impossible happened. The Phantom convoy accelerated, closing the distance between them and Marcus's truck rapidly. Within seconds, they were right on his bumper, their headlights filling his mirrors with that harsh blue-white glare. Then the lead truck pulled into the left lane and began to pass him. Marcus got his first clear look at the driver as the truck pulled alongside his cab. It was a man, or had been once. The face was gray and sunken. The eyes were empty black pits, and the mouth hung open in a soundless scream or laugh. Marcus couldn't tell which. The thing wasn't gripping the steering wheel. Its hands had somehow fused to it. The flesh melted into the old, cracked leather. The second and third trucks pulled alongside as well, boxing him in, and Marcus saw that all three drivers were the same, grey corpses piloting their eternal route. The trucks forced Marcus to maintain his speed, not allowing him to slow down for the accident scene. As they passed it, Marcus looked desperately toward the police officers, trying to catch someone's eye, to signal for help. But the officers didn't look up. They continued their work as if a convoy of ghost trucks and a terrified driver weren't passing within 50 feet of them. Marcus realized with horror that the police couldn't see the phantom trucks. To them, he was just another driver passing through the night. After the accident scene disappeared behind them, the three trucks fell back into formation behind Marcus. The message was clear. He couldn't stop, couldn't get help. Whatever was happening, he had to see it through alone. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, a combination of terror and exhaustion, and the growing certainty that he might not survive this night. He drove for another hour in that nightmare procession. The phantom trucks never left his mirrors, never varied their distance or formation. Marcus's mind began to fracture, caught between the need to stay alert and drive safely, and the overwhelming urge to close his eyes and make it all go away. He started seeing things in the darkness alongside the road, figures standing in the trees, buildings that shouldn't exist, signs in languages he didn't recognize. At mile marker 193, something changed. The road ahead split into two highways, one continuing on 84 toward Boise, the other branching off onto a route that Marcus didn't recognize. The sign for the branch road was weathered and hard to read, but he could make out enough letters to see that it wasn't any highway he'd ever heard of. His GPS showed only the main highway, no branch. But the road was there, as solid and real as anything else. The phantom trucks pulled alongside him again, the three drivers turning their ruined faces toward him in unison. The lead driver raised one fused hand from the steering wheel, an impossible gesture that must have caused incredible pain if the thing could still feel pain, and pointed toward the branch road. The message was unmistakable. Take that exit. Every instinct Marcus had screamed at him to stay on the main highway, to refuse their direction. But he also knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that refusing would end badly. The trucks would force him off the road, or drive him to exhaustion, or simply keep following him forever. The branch road, as wrong and impossible as it was, represented his only chance to escape. Marcus took the exit. His truck rumbled onto the branch road, and the phantom convoy followed. The road surface changed immediately, becoming rougher, older, like asphalt from decades past. The landscape on either side shifted as well, the trees growing thicker and darker, the terrain more rugged. Marcus's GPS flickered and went dead. His fuel gauge, which had shown half a tank moments before, now read nearly empty. They drove for what felt like hours, though Marcus's clock had stopped working. The branch road wound through increasingly strange terrain, valleys that shouldn't exist in this part of Oregon, forests of trees that were the wrong species and size, mountains that appeared and disappeared depending on the angle of approach. The three trucks maintained their formation, shepherding Marcus deeper into this impossible geography. Finally, the road emerged into a clearing. In the center stood what looked like an old truck stop. but one that had been abandoned for decades. The sign read, "Crossroads Rest," and the building was in the same state of decay as the Phantom trucks. Marcus pulled into the parking lot because there was nowhere else to go. The road ended here. The 3 trucks pulled up beside him, and for the first time since the nightmare began, shut off their engines. Marcus sat in his cab, paralyzed with fear, watching as the doors of the Phantom trucks opened. The thread drivers climbed out, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. They stood in a line, facing Marcus's truck, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then the lead driver, the one who had pointed toward the exit, raised his hand again and beckoned. Something in Marcus knew that if he got out of his truck here, in this place that existed outside the normal roads, he would never leave. He would become like them, another Phantom driver trapped in an eternal convoy, following new victims through the night. He gripped his steering wheel, his hands white-knuckled, and shook his head. "No," he whispered. Then louder, "No, I'm not getting out. I'm not staying here." The 3 figures tilted their heads in unison, a gesture that might have been surprise or confusion. Marcus turned his key, praying his engine would start. It turned over once, twice, and then caught. He threw the truck into reverse and began backing up, his eyes fixed on the 3 figures. They didn't move to stop him. They just watched as he maneuvered his truck around and headed back the way he'd come. The return journey was a blur. The strange landscape flowed past his windows, the wrong trees and impossible valleys gradually giving way to more normal terrain. His GPS flickered back to life, showing him on Highway 84, approaching Boise. His fuel gauge returned to showing half a tank. His clock read 4:47 a.m. Behind him, the branch road and the Crossroads Rest simply vanished, as if they'd never existed. Marcus made his delivery in Boise at 6:15 a.m. He told dispatch he'd had to take a detour due to an accident on the highway. No one questioned it. He completed his return run to Portland in a daze, barely aware of the miles passing beneath his tires. When he got home, he slept for 16 hours straight, his dreams filled with blue-white headlights and gray faces fused to steering wheels. He never took an overnight run on Highway 84 again. He requested transfers to daytime routes, even though they paid less. When other drivers asked why, he made up excuses about wanting to see his family more, about getting too old for the night shifts. Most accepted his explanations, but occasionally he'd run into another driver who'd look at him with knowing eyes and say something like, "The night roads are different, aren't they? They go places the day roads don't." Marcus would nod and change the subject. Because what could he say? That he'd been herded into a place that didn't exist by trucks that shouldn't be moving. That he'd been given a choice to join the Phantom convoy or flee. No one would believe it. Hell, on his better days, Marcus barely believed it himself. But on nights when sleep wouldn't come, he'd stand by his window and look out at the highway in the distance, watching the lights of trucks passing through the darkness, and he'd wonder which of them were real and which were just echoes, trapped forever on roads that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Story 3. The Breathing Cargo. Denise Kowalski had been running her own independent hauling operation for 12 years, specializing in refrigerated goods along the East Coast. She took pride in her work, maintaining her equipment meticulously and never missing a delivery. On October 23, 2020, she picked up what seemed like a routine job. A temperature-controlled shipment from a warehouse in rural Pennsylvania to a medical research facility in Northern Virginia. The pay was good, better than usual for the distance, and the dispatcher assured her it was a straightforward run. The warehouse was located down a long access road, surrounded by dense forest. Denise arrived at 3:30 p.m., backing her refrigerated trailer up to the loading dock, as she'd done thousands of times before. A man in a lab coat, who introduced himself only as Dr. Venner, supervised the loading process. He was insistent about the temperature requirements. Exactly 34 degrees Fahrenheit, not a degree higher or lower. He made Denise check and double-check her refrigeration unit before allowing his crew to load the cargo. "What exactly am I hauling?" Denise asked as workers wheeled in sealed containers on dollies. Each container was about the size of a large cooler, made of brushed metal with biohazard symbols stenciled on the sides. There were 8 containers in total, secured with heavy straps to anchor points in her trailer. Dr. Venner gave her a thin smile. Biological samples, extremely sensitive to temperature fluctuation. They're completely safe as long as they stay cold. The containers are triple sealed, so you won't have any contamination issues. Just maintain the temperature and deliver them by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Can you do that? Denise nodded. No problem. I've hauled medical supplies before. The reefer unit on this trailer is practically new, very reliable. She signed the paperwork, did her pre-trip inspection, and pulled out of the facility at 4:47 p.m. The route would take her south through the Appalachian back roads before joining I-81 for the final leg to the research facility. It was a 7-hour drive under normal conditions, giving her plenty of buffer time. The first hour was uneventful. Denise navigated the winding 2-lane roads that cut through the mountains, her refrigeration unit humming steadily in the background. She checked the temperature gauge every few minutes, a habit from years of hauling sensitive cargo. 34 degrees, exactly as specified. The sun was setting, painting the autumn leaves in shades of orange and gold. It would have been beautiful if Denise hadn't been focused on the road. Around 6:15 p.m., she stopped at a small truck stop to grab dinner and use the restroom. She checked her trailer as she always did, walking around it to inspect the tires, the refrigeration unit, and the seal on the doors. Everything looked fine. The reefer unit was running smoothly, and the temperature gauge inside the cab still showed 34 degrees. Denise allowed herself a moment to relax and went inside for a quick meal. When she came back out 20 minutes later, something felt off. She couldn't articulate what it was at first, just a nagging sense that something had changed. She walked around the trailer again, checking everything more carefully. The doors were still sealed. The refrigeration unit was running. The temperature was correct. But Denise stood there in the gathering darkness, staring at her trailer, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. She dismissed it as paranoia and climbed back into her cab. She had a schedule to keep, and standing around second-guessing herself wouldn't help. Denise pulled back onto the road and continued south. The sun disappeared completely, and the mountain roads became ribbons of darkness broken only by her headlights. Traffic was sparse, just the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. Around 7:30 p.m., Denise heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the engine noise and the hum of the refrigeration unit. A rhythmic thump, almost like a heartbeat, coming from behind her. She turned down the radio and listened more carefully. There it was again. Thump, 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 slow and steady. It seemed to be coming from the trailer. Denise told herself it was just something shifting in the cargo. Maybe one of the containers had come loose despite the straps. It happened sometimes. Cargo could settle during transport, especially on winding roads. But the sound continued, regular as a metronome, and after a few minutes, Denise realized it didn't match the movement of the truck. It maintained the same rhythm whether she was accelerating, braking, or turning. It was independent of the vehicle's motion. She found a wide spot on the shoulder and pulled over. Denise grabbed her flashlight and walked to the back of the trailer, her breath fogging in the cold October air. She unlocked the doors and swung them open, the refrigerated air rolling out like fog. She climbed inside, shining her flashlight over the 8 containers. They were all still secure, strapped tightly to the anchor points. Nothing had shifted. But as Denise stood there in the cold trailer, she heard the sound more clearly. Thump, 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 thump. It was definitely coming from inside one of the containers, maybe more than one. It sounded organic, muscular, like a giant heartbeat. Denise approached the nearest container and placed her hand on its metal surface. She felt vibration, a rhythmic pulse that matched the sound. The metal was cold, as it should be, but somehow the vibration felt warm, alive. Biological samples, she muttered to herself. Right. What kind of samples have heartbeats? She backed out of the trailer and locked the doors, her hands shaking slightly. This was wrong. She should call Dr. Venner and demand an explanation. But when she checked her phone, there was no signal. These mountain roads were notorious dead zones for cellular service. She'd have to wait until she reached the valley to make the call. Denise climbed back into her cab and continued driving. But now she couldn't ignore the sound. It had grown louder, or maybe she was just more aware of it. Thump, 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 thump. It filled the cab, steady and relentless. She turned the radio up loud, trying to drown it out with music, but she could still hear it underneath, feel it vibrating through the seat. At mile marker 87 on Route 522, the sound changed. Instead of the steady heartbeat, Denise heard what sounded like breathing. Deep, labored breaths, as if something large was struggling for air. She pulled over again, this time with her heart racing. This wasn't cargo shifting. This was something alive in her trailer. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. She grabbed her phone, hoping desperately for a signal. Still nothing. Denise sat in her cab, listening to the breathing sounds grow louder and more distressed. She thought about abandoning the load, just unhitching the trailer and driving away. But she'd signed a contract. She'd face penalties, maybe legal action. And part of her, the part that had survived 12 years as an independent trucker through sheer determination, refused to be defeated by strange sounds and her own fear. Denise decided to push through. The breathing continued as she drove, sometimes fast and shallow, other times slow and deep. Occasionally she'd hear other sounds mixed in, wet, sliding noises that made her think of something moving in confined space, pressing against metal walls. The temperature gauge fluctuated slightly, dropping to 33 degrees and then climbing to 35, before settling back to 34. Something in that trailer was generating heat. Around 10 p.m., Denise merged onto I-81 South. The interstate was busier than the mountain roads, with trucks and cars providing a comforting sense of normalcy. But the sounds from her trailer intensified. The breathing became ragged, punctuated by what sounded like scratching or scraping against metal. Denise pushed her rig to 75 miles per hour, desperate to reach the research facility and unload whatever was in those containers. Then, at 10:47 p.m., everything in the trailer went silent. The breathing stopped. The thumping stopped. The scraping stopped. For a moment, Denise felt relief. Maybe whatever was in there had died, or gone dormant, or maybe she'd been hallucinating the whole thing due to stress and exhaustion. But the silence didn't last. A new sound emerged, worse than all the others. It was a voice, or multiple voices, hard to tell. They were whispering, a susurrus of words that Denise couldn't quite make out, but that filled her with deep, instinctive dread. The voices seemed to be coming from all around her, not just from the trailer behind her, but from the cab itself, as if something was speaking directly into her ears. Denise screamed and swerved, nearly hitting the guardrail before she regained control. The Tsakyam voices continued, getting louder, and now she could make out individual words. Cold. Dark. Let us out. So hungry. Please. The words overlapped and echoed, creating a cacophony that drilled into her skull. She clapped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to block the sounds. She had to pull over. She couldn't drive like this, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Denise took the next exit, pulling into an empty rest area. She parked and sat there, hands pressed against her ears, while the voices pleaded and demanded and begged. Let us out! Let us out! Let us out! They chanted in unison, and underneath that, she heard something else. A sound like liquid dripping and flesh sliding against metal. The temperature gauge in her cab, which monitored the refrigeration unit, began to climb. 35 degrees, 37, 40. The containers were warming up, and whatever was inside was becoming more active. Denise fumbled for her phone. Still no signal, even here at the rest area, where there should have been coverage. It was as if something was interfering with the cellular network. She had to look. Every fiber of her being screamed not to, but she had to see what was in those containers. Maybe if she saw it, understood what she was dealing with, she could figure out how to survive this night. Denise grabbed her flashlight and a tire iron from the toolbox behind her seat. She climbed out of the cab on shaking legs and walked to the back of the trailer. The voices grew louder as she approached. Yes, yes, open it. Let us out. Let us see. Let us breathe. Denise unlocked the doors and pulled them open. The refrigerated air that rolled out was warmer than before, and it carried a smell that made her gag, something like formaldehyde and rotting meat and ozone. She climbed into the trailer, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The containers were moving. Not much, just slight rocking motions, but they were definitely moving. The straps holding them down were stretched tight, and in some places they'd begun to fray. Denise approached the nearest container, the one that had been vibrating earlier. Up close, she could see that the metal surface was bulging slightly, as if something inside was pressing against it from within. Don't open it, she whispered to herself. Don't you dare open it. But her hand reached for the latches anyway, drawn by a morbid need to understand. Before she could touch them, the container gave a violent shake. The latches rattled but held. Whatever was inside hit the walls with enough force to dent the metal from within. All 8 containers began to shake simultaneously. The voices returned, now clearly coming from inside the metal boxes. "Let us out! We've been good. We've been patient. It's so cold. It's so dark. Let us out!" The shaking intensified, and Denise heard the straps starting to snap under the strain. She backed toward the trailer doors, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she stumbled. One of the straps broke with a sound like a gunshot. The container it had been holding lurched forward, sliding a few inches across the trailer floor. Denise turned and ran, jumping out of the trailer and slamming the doors shut. She locked them with trembling hands and ran back to her cab. She had to move, had to get to that research facility before whatever was in those containers broke free completely. She drove like a woman possessed, pushing her rig to 80 miles per hour on the interstate. Behind her, she could hear the containers crashing against the walls of the trailer, could hear the metal groaning and buckling. The voices continued their chorus of pleas and threats. The temperature gauge showed 45 degrees now, climbing steadily despite the refrigeration unit running at maximum capacity. At 11:34 p.m., Denise's phone suddenly showed a signal. She grabbed it and called the number Dr. Venner had given her for emergencies. It rang 3 times before he answered. "Dr. Venner," he said, his voice calm and measured. "What the hell is in my trailer?" Denise shouted. "What did you load? It's alive. It's trying to get out. You said biological samples. You didn't say they were—" She didn't know how to finish that sentence. "Ms. Kowalski," Dr. Venner interrupted, "please remain calm. What's the current temperature of the cargo?" 46 degrees and climbing. The refrigeration unit can't keep up. There's something generating heat, lots of heat, and it's moving. And there are voices. 46 degrees, Dr. Venner repeated. And for the first time, she heard concern in his voice. "That's too warm. You need to get here immediately. How far out are you?" 20 minutes, maybe less. I'm going as fast as I can. What happens if they get warmer?" There was a pause. "They'll wake up fully. And if they wake up fully, the containers won't hold them. Just drive, Ms. Kowalski. Drive as fast as you safely can." He hung up. Denise pushed her truck even harder. The crashing sounds from the trailer grew more violent. She heard metal tearing, the shriek of containers being torn open. The voices were no longer whispering or pleading. They were laughing, a sound that was wrong in every possible way. Too many tones at once, too many emotions mixed together. Triumphant and hungry and joyous and malevolent. She saw the exit for the research facility ahead and took it at dangerous speed, the trailer swaying behind her. The access road was long and dark, winding through more dense forest. Denise kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look in her mirrors at whatever might be emerging from her trailer. She could feel the trailer getting lighter, as if the cargo was redistributing itself, or climbing the walls, or flowing toward the doors. The research facility appeared ahead, a modern building blazing with lights despite the late hour. Security gates were already opening as Denise approached. Men in hazmat suits were waiting in the loading area. She backed her trailer up to the dock with a precision born of 12 years of practice, even though every instinct screamed at her to unhitch and run. The moment her trailer was in position, the hazmat-suited team swarmed around it. Dr. Venner approached her cab, his face grim. "Stay in your truck," he said through her window. Don't get out. Don't look back there. Just wait. Denise nodded, too exhausted and terrified to argue. She heard sounds from behind her, the trailer doors opening, shouts from the hazmat team, equipment humming and beeping. There was a bright flash of light, like a camera flash but much larger, followed by a hissing sound and then silence. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Dr. Venner knocked on her window again. "You can come out now. It's safe." Denise climbed out on shaking legs. Her trailer doors were closed again, and the hazmat team was packing up their equipment. "What was that?" she asked. "What was really in those containers?" Dr. Venner looked at her for a long moment before answering. "A failed experiment. Organisms that were supposed to remain in stasis, but began to revive during transport. You did well to get them here when you did. Another 15 minutes, and they would have broken through completely. What would have happened then? Nothing good, Miss Kowalski. Nothing good at all." He handed her an envelope. "Your payment, plus a substantial bonus, and a non-disclosure agreement that I'll need you to sign. You can't talk about this to anyone. Not other drivers, not your family, no one." Denise took the envelope with numb fingers. "I don't want to haul for you people again." "That won't be a problem. We don't use the same driver twice." Dr. Venner smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for your service. You can unhitch your trailer here. We'll handle it from this point." Denise signed the non-disclosure agreement, unhitched her trailer, and drove away from that facility as fast as her empty cab would carry her. She didn't look back. When she got home the next day, she found that the bonus he'd mentioned was enough to pay off her truck and cover 6 months of expenses. She also found that she couldn't talk about what had happened. Not because of the legal agreement, but because every time she tried to tell someone, the words wouldn't come. Her throat would close up, and she'd hear, faint but unmistakable, those voices whispering, cold, dark, hungry. Denise stopped taking refrigerated loads after that. She switched to dry goods exclusively, even though it meant a pay cut. Other truckers in her network noticed the change and asked about it, but she just shrugged and said she wanted something different. On cold nights, when the temperature dropped below freezing, she'd sometimes hear that rhythmic thumping sound, thump, 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 like a heartbeat echoing from somewhere far away. And she'd turn up the heat in whatever room she was in and remind herself that she'd survived, that she'd gotten those things to their destination before they fully awakened. But she never forgot the voices or the feeling of her trailer getting lighter as something inside redistributed itself, or the look in Dr. Venner's eyes when he thanked her for her service. Some cargo, she learned, was better left undelivered. Some things were better left in the cold and the dark where they belonged. And some runs, no matter how much they paid, weren't worth the price they extracted from your peace of mind. Story 4. The Reversed Road. Tommy Briggs had been driving for Midwest Logistics for 9 years when he took the run from Minneapolis to Rapid City on March 19th, 2018. It was a straightforward haul, building materials destined for a construction site in South Dakota. The weather forecast showed clear skies, and Tommy was looking forward to a smooth, uneventful trip. He'd driven this route dozens of times and knew it well. The only challenge was the late start. He didn't pull out of the depot until 11:45 p.m., due to a delay in loading, which meant most of the drive would be in the dark. Tommy didn't mind night driving. He actually preferred it in many ways. Less traffic, fewer distractions, just the road and his thoughts. He had his audiobook queued up, a thriller that his wife had recommended, and a thermos of coffee to keep him sharp. He merged onto I-94 westbound and settled into the rhythm of the highway, his headlights cutting through the March darkness. The first few hours passed exactly as expected. Tommy made good time through the flat Minnesota landscape, the occasional small town appearing as a cluster of lights in the distance before fading back into darkness. He stopped at a truck stop near Fargo at 2:30 a.m. for fuel and a bathroom break, exchanged a few words with another driver about road conditions ahead, and was back on the highway by 2:50 a.m. According to his GPS, he'd reach Rapid City around 7:15 a.m., well ahead of his 9 a.m. delivery window. Around 3:45 a.m., somewhere between Fargo and Bismarck, Tommy noticed something odd. The mile markers seemed wrong. He was sure he'd just passed marker 331, but a few minutes later, he saw marker 330, then 329. The markers were counting down instead of up. Tommy frowned and glanced at his GPS. According to the screen, he was still heading west on I-94, making steady progress toward Bismarck. But the mile markers clearly showed him going in the opposite direction. "Must be a glitch," he muttered, tapping the GPS screen. But it continued to show him on the correct route, moving in the right direction. Tommy focused on the road ahead, looking for other signs that might confirm his direction of travel. The problem was, at 3:45 a.m. on this stretch of interstate, there wasn't much to see, just darkness and the occasional set of taillights in the distance. He passed a highway sign that read, Bismarck, 47 miles, which matched what his GPS showed. But the next mile marker was 328, counting down. Tommy felt a prickle of unease. This was wrong, fundamentally wrong. Mile markers always counted up in the direction of travel. If they were counting down, it meant he was going the wrong way, heading east instead of west. But that was impossible. He hadn't exited the highway, hadn't turned around. He'd been driving in a straight line for hours. Tommy checked his compass, a small one he kept mounted on his dashboard, because he didn't entirely trust technology. The compass showed him heading west. The GPS showed him heading west, but the mile markers insisted he was going east. Tommy grabbed his CB radio. "This is hammer time on I-94 near Bismarck. Anybody out there got their ears on? I got a weird question about mile markers." Static answered him. He tried again on different channels, but all he got was that empty, hissing static. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in rural North Dakota. But the timing felt ominous. He decided to trust his instruments over the mile markers. Maybe there was some explanation he wasn't aware of. Maybe construction had caused them to be replaced incorrectly, or maybe he was just tired and misreading them. Tommy continued driving west, according to his GPS and compass, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The next sign he passed gave him new information. Bismarck, 52 miles. Tommy's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That couldn't be right. 5 minutes ago, Bismarck had been 47 miles away. Now it was 52 miles. He was somehow getting farther from his destination, instead of closer, even though he was driving toward it at 65 miles per hour. Tommy looked at his odometer. Since the last sign, he'd driven 7.2 miles. His fuel gauge had dropped appropriately. His clock showed that the right amount of time had passed. But somehow, he'd lost ground. The road had taken those miles, and added them to his destination instead of subtracting them. A cold sweat broke out on Tommy's forehead. This was impossible. This violated basic laws of physics and geometry. Roads didn't work this way. Distance didn't work this way. But the signs didn't lie, and neither did his instruments. He was trapped in some kind of spatial paradox where driving forward moved him backward. Tommy made a decision. He would pull over, stop completely, and try to figure out what was happening. Maybe if he stopped moving, the wrongness would resolve itself. He eased his rig onto the shoulder, the rumble strips buzzing under his tires, and came to a complete stop. He put the truck in park and sat there, engine idling, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked in his mirrors. The highway behind him stretched into darkness, empty of other vehicles. He looked ahead. The same emptiness greeted him. Tommy realized he hadn't seen another car or truck in over an hour, not since before the mile markers started counting backward. The highway was deserted, just him and his rig and the wrong road. After 5 minutes of sitting still, Tommy started moving again. He had to reach Bismarck, had to find other people, or a police station or something that would help him understand what was happening. He accelerated back to 65 miles per hour and watched the mile markers. 327, 326, 225, all counting down. The next sign read, Bismarck, 58 miles. No, Tommy said aloud. No, that's not right. I'm getting closer, not farther. But the road disagreed. It was stretching ahead of him, adding miles faster than he could drive them. At this rate, he'd never reach Bismarck. He'd drive forever, burning fuel, wearing down his truck, while his destination receded into an infinite distance. Tommy tried turning around. He slowed down, crossed the median, and started heading back the way he'd come, now officially going east. Maybe if he reversed course, the paradox would reverse too. But the mile markers still counted down, 324, 323, 22, and the signs now read, Fargo, 73 miles, even though Fargo should have been closer than that. No matter which direction he drove, he was moving away from everywhere. Panic was setting in now, making it hard to think. Tommy pulled over again and grabbed his phone, hoping desperately for a signal. Nothing. He tried the CB radio on every channel. Static. He looked at his GPS, and his heart sank. The screen was glitching, showing him in multiple locations simultaneously. One dot placed him on I-94. Another showed him on a highway in Canada. A third placed him in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The device didn't know where he was anymore, because he wasn't really anywhere. Tommy climbed out of his cab, needing to feel solid ground under his feet. The March air was cold, his breath fogging immediately. He walked around his truck, checking that it was real, that he was real. Everything seemed normal. The asphalt under his boots was solid. His truck was intact, the load secured properly. The stars overhead were bright and clear. But when Tommy looked at those stars more carefully, he realized they were wrong too. The constellations were familiar but distorted, stretched and compressed as if he was viewing them through a warped lens. The Big Dipper was there, but its handle bent at an impossible angle. Orion hung near the horizon, but his belt had 5 stars instead of 3. "Where am I?" Tommy whispered to the empty night. "Where the hell am I?" A sound answered him, distant but growing closer. It was an engine, another truck approaching from the east. Tommy felt a surge of hope. Another driver, someone else on this road, someone who might have answers, or at least confirmation, that he wasn't losing his mind. He stood by the side of his truck and waved his arms as the headlights approached. The truck slowed and pulled onto the shoulder ahead of Tommy's rig. It was an older model, maybe from the 1990s, and it looked well-maintained despite its age. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed out. He was in his 60s, with grey hair and a weathered face. He walked toward Tommy with a friendly smile. "You look lost, friend," the man said. His voice had a strange quality, slightly echoing, as if he was speaking in a large empty room instead of on an open highway. "I don't know what's happening," Tommy said, the words tumbling out. "The mile markers are counting backward. The distances are wrong. My GPS is glitching. Am I going crazy? Do you see it too?" The older driver nodded slowly. "I see it. You're on the reversed road. It happens sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. A driver takes a wrong turn they don't remember taking, or they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they end up here." "Here? Where is here?" "Nowhere and everywhere. It's a road that exists between other roads, a highway that connects places that shouldn't be connected. You can't reach your destination from here. The more you drive, the farther away everything gets." Tommy felt his knees go weak. "How do I get off it? How do I get back to the normal road?" The older driver looked sad. "Some people never do. They drive until they run out of fuel, and then they just stay, become part of the road. Others find a way out, but it costs them. Costs them what? Something. Different for everyone. For me, it cost 20 years. I got on this road in 1987, and when I finally got off, it was 2007. Everyone I knew had aged, moved on, given me up for dead. But I hadn't aged a day." He gestured to his truck. "That's why I'm still driving this old girl. It's the only thing that came with me from then to now." Tommy stared at him in horror. 20 years? I can't lose 20 years. I have a wife, kids. I'm supposed to be home in 3 days. Then you need to find the exit before you run out of fuel. There's a way off this road, but it only appears when you're not looking for it. The harder you try to find it, the more it hides. You have to let go. Stop trying to reach anywhere and just drive. When you give up on arriving, that's when the exit appears." "That doesn't make any sense." The older driver laughed, that echoing wrong sound. "Nothing about this place makes sense. That's the point. It's a road that follows dream logic, not real logic. You want my advice? Don't think about where you're going. Don't check the signs or the mile markers. Just drive and let your mind wander. Think about anything except the road. That's how I found my way out, eventually." He walked back to his truck, and Tommy called after him. "Wait. What if I can't do it? What if I can't stop thinking about the road?" The older driver paused with his hand on the door. "Then you'd better hope you've got a lot of fuel." He climbed into his cab and pulled away, his taillights disappearing into the distance faster than they should have. Tommy stood there for a long moment, trying to process what he'd just learned. Then he climbed back into his own truck, looking at his fuel gauge. He had just over 3/4 of a tank, enough for maybe 500 miles of normal driving. But this wasn't normal driving. He had no idea how much fuel he'd actually burn on a road where distance didn't work correctly. He started driving again, trying to follow the older driver's advice. Don't think about the road. Don't check the signs. Just drive. Tommy turned off his GPS, covered his odometer with a piece of paper, and tried to focus on his audiobook. But how could he stop thinking about the road? when every fiber of his being was screaming that he was trapped. He forced himself to think about his family, his wife Sarah, who'd been so patient with his long absences, his daughter Emma, who'd just started high school, his son Jake, who wanted to be a trucker like his dad. Tommy pictured their faces, remembered conversations and laughter, and ordinary moments that suddenly seemed incredibly precious. The road flowed past, and Tommy stopped looking at the mile markers. He had no idea how long he drove like that, caught between terror and desperate hope. Time felt fluid, minutes stretching and compressing. At some point, dawn should have broken, but the sky remained stubbornly dark. Then, without warning, Tommy saw an exit sign ahead. It didn't have a number or a destination. It just showed an arrow pointing right. The exit ramp appeared in his headlights, ordinary asphalt curving away from the main highway. Tommy didn't hesitate. He took the exit, his heart pounding. The ramp led to a 2-lane road that looked utterly normal. There were trees on either side, proper trees with properly arranged branches. The stars overhead had returned to their correct positions. Tommy's GPS flickered back to life, showing him on Route 83 heading south toward Bismarck. His phone suddenly had signal, 5 bars, and a flood of notifications from missed calls and texts. Tommy pulled over and checked the time. 4:23 a.m., March 20th. He'd lost only 40 minutes, not 20 years. He looked at his fuel gauge. It showed half a tank, appropriate for the distance he thought he'd traveled. He started laughing, a sound that was part relief and part hysteria. He made it to Bismarck, delivered his load on time, and drove home to Minnesota in a daze. When he got home, he hugged his wife and kids fiercely, grateful for every normal, wonderful moment with them. Sarah asked if he was okay, said he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Tommy just nodded and said it had been a long run. He never told anyone about the reversed road. Who would believe him? But he thought about the older driver, the man who'd lost 20 years, and wondered how many other truckers were out there somewhere, driving on roads that led nowhere, burning fuel and hope in equal measure. He thought about them every time he saw an older rig on the highway, wondering if the driver had found their way back or was still searching for an exit that only appeared when they stopped looking. Tommy kept driving for Midwest Logistics, but he never took another late-night run if he could avoid it. He'd learned that the highway network was bigger and stranger than anyone realized, that there were roads between roads, paths that shouldn't exist but did. And he'd learned that sometimes the only way forward was to stop trying to get anywhere at all. It was a lesson he carried with him for the rest of his career, a reminder that in a world of GPS and computers and precise navigation, there were still places where logic broke down, and you had to trust something deeper than instruments to find your way home. Story 5. The Last Rest Stop. Carl Henderson had been hauling freight across the American Southwest for 14 years, specializing in routes through Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. On August 3, 2019, he picked up a load of consumer electronics in Phoenix, bound for Albuquerque. It was a summer run, which meant dealing with brutal heat and the constant threat of mechanical problems from the temperature extremes. Carl had prepared accordingly, ensuring his air conditioning was topped off, his coolant levels were good, and he had plenty of water for both himself and his truck. He left Phoenix at 2:00 p.m., planning to drive through the hottest part of the day and arrive in Albuquerque by midnight. The route took him east on I-10 before branching onto smaller highways that cut through some of the most desolate landscape in the country. Carl didn't mind the emptiness. He'd grown up in rural Nevada and felt comfortable with vast stretches of nothing, punctuated by the occasional truck stop or tiny town. By 8:30 p.m., Carl was deep into the New Mexico desert, the sun setting in a spectacular display of orange and purple behind him. The temperature had finally started to drop from its daytime high of 107 degrees, though it was still warm enough that he kept his air conditioning running. Traffic was light, just the occasional car or truck passing in the opposite direction. His CB radio crackled with intermittent chatter from other drivers on parallel routes. Around 9:15 p.m., Carl felt the first signs that something was wrong with his truck. The engine temperature gauge crept higher than normal, not into the danger zone yet, but enough to be concerning. He tapped it, hoping it was just a faulty sensor, but the needle held steady at the elevated temperature. Carl swore under his breath. The last thing he needed was an overheating problem in the middle of the desert at night. He decided to find a place to pull over and check the engine. According to his GPS, there was a rest area about 12 miles ahead. Carl nursed his truck along, watching the temperature gauge carefully. It climbed a bit higher, but seemed to stabilize. He could smell hot engine oil and coolant, that distinctive scent of a vehicle being pushed to its thermal limits. The rest area appeared in his headlights at mile marker 164, exactly where his GPS said it would be. It was a standard New Mexico DOT facility, a parking area with spaces for about a dozen vehicles, some covered picnic tables, restrooms, and the ubiquitous bulletin board with tourist information and safety notices. The lighting was poor, just a few overhead lights that created more shadows than illumination. Carl pulled into one of the truck spaces and shut off his engine, listening to the ticking of hot metal. He climbed out of his cab, the desert night air hitting him with surprising coolness after hours in the air-conditioned cab. Carl walked to the front of his truck and popped the hood, releasing a wave of heat. He shined his flashlight into the engine compartment, looking for obvious problems. The coolant reservoir level looked okay. No visible leaks, no broken hoses. The radiator fan was functioning. Maybe it had just been the ambient heat pushing everything to the edge, and now that the sun was down, the problem would resolve itself. Carl decided to give the engine 30 minutes to cool down before continuing. He walked over to the rest area facilities, planning to use the restroom and refill his water bottle. The building was typical of these remote rest stops. Concrete block construction painted in desert tan, heavy metal doors, harsh fluorescent lighting inside. Carl pushed open the men's room door and immediately noticed something odd. The lights were on, but the fixtures were old, much older than they should have been. They were the kind of industrial fluorescent tubes from the 1960s or 70s, with yellowed plastic covers and that distinctive flicker and hum that modern fixtures didn't have. The sinks were old, too, white porcelain with separate hot and cold taps, instead of the single lever designs that had been standard for decades. The whole room had a dated feel, as if it had been built 50 years ago, and never updated. Carl used the facilities and washed his hands, the cold water tap producing only a thin, rust-tinged stream. When he looked up at the mirror, he felt a chill despite the warm night air. His reflection looked wrong. Not drastically wrong, but subtly off. The angle of the lighting made his face appear gaunter older. His eyes seemed to have dark circles he hadn't noticed before. He blinked and the impression faded, leaving him unsure if he'd really seen anything strange, or if it was just the poor lighting and his own fatigue. He left the restroom and walked to the covered picnic area, thinking he'd sit for a few minutes and let his truck cool completely. As he approached the tables, Carl realized there were other people at the rest stop, something he hadn't noticed when he first pulled in. There was a family, parents and 2 kids, sitting at one of the picnic tables. There was an older man leaning against an RV parked in one of the smaller vehicle spaces, and there was a woman standing near the information board, studying it intently. What struck Carl as strange was how still they all were. The family wasn't talking or moving. They just sat there in a tableau of frozen normalcy. The older man by the RV stood with his arms crossed, staring at nothing. The woman at the information board was so motionless, she might have been a statue. Carl's unease deepened. "Evening," he called out to the family. No one responded. The parents didn't turn to look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. Carl walked closer. "Hey, you folks okay?" Still nothing. He was close enough now to see their faces clearly, and what he saw made his blood run cold. They weren't breathing. He watched the father's chest for a full 30 seconds and saw no rise and fall. The children, a boy and a girl who looked to be about 8 and 10 years old, sat with their eyes open but didn't blink. Their skin had a waxy quality in the harsh light, like mannequins rather than living people. Carl backed away, his heart racing. He looked at the older man by the RV, saw the same unnatural stillness, the same absence of breath. The woman at the information board hadn't moved a millimeter. They were all frozen or dead, or something else that Carl's mind couldn't quite accept. He turned to run back to his truck, to get the hell out of this place regardless of his engine temperature. But when he looked toward his parking spot, his truck was gone. The space where he'd parked just minutes ago was empty. Carl spun around, disoriented, looking at the other parking spaces. His truck wasn't in any of them. It had simply vanished. "No, no, no," Carl muttered, pulling out his keys as if that would somehow make his truck reappear. "This isn't happening." He ran to the parking area, looking for any sign of where his rig might have gone. There were no tire tracks in the dust, no indication that the truck had been moved. It was just gone, as if it had never existed. Carl's panic was reaching a breaking point. He fumbled for his cell phone, hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. No signal. The screen showed 0 bars, even though he'd had a good signal just 20 minutes earlier, when he'd checked his GPS. He tried calling 911 anyway, but the call failed immediately. He looked up and realized something else was wrong. The desert surrounding the rest area looked different. The landscape had changed. The shapes of the hills in the distance were wrong, and the stars overhead were too bright, too numerous, as if he was seeing them through a perfectly clear atmosphere that Earth's sky didn't have. And the lights from distant towns and highways, lights that should have been visible as faint glows on the horizon, were absent. There was nothing around the rest area except empty desert, extending in all directions. Carl forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. He walked back to the building and looked at the information board the woman was standing in front of. The tourist brochures and safety notices were all badly faded, printed on paper that looked decades old. He read one of the notices, a warning about flash floods, and saw that it was dated July 1973. Another notice advertised an event in Albuquerque from 1968. The newest piece of paper on the board was a missing person flyer from 1981. The woman standing in front of the board still hadn't moved. Carl looked at her more carefully and felt his stomach turn. She was wearing a dress from the 1970s, her hair styled in a way that had been fashionable 50 years ago. Her purse was vintage, her shoes were vintage. Everything about her was from another era. Carl reached out, some part of him needing to confirm that she was real, and touched her shoulder. She was cold, not just cool from the night air, but genuinely cold, like touching refrigerated meat. And she was rigid, her joints locked in place. Carl jerked his hand back and stumbled away from her. The woman was dead, had been dead for a long time, but somehow she was still standing there, preserved in this impossible place. Carl's mind was fracturing, unable to reconcile what he was experiencing with any rational explanation. He was at a rest stop that existed in the wrong time, surrounded by people who were dead but still present, and his truck had vanished into thin air. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but where could he run to? The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, and he had no water, no supplies, no transportation. He decided to explore the rest area more thoroughly, looking for any clue about what this place was, or how to escape it. Behind the main building, he found more parking spaces he hadn't noticed before. These were occupied by vehicles, cars and trucks and RVs, all from different eras. There was a pickup truck from the 1960s, a sedan from the 1980s, a motorcycle from the 1990s. All of them were dusty and showed signs of long abandonment, but none of them were rusted or damaged in ways that decades of exposure to the elements should have produced. Carl approached the pickup truck and looked through the driver's window. There was a man behind the wheel, slumped forward against the steering wheel, as motionless as the others. The truck's keys were still in the ignition. Carl tried the door, found it unlocked, and opened it. The man slumped sideways, and Carl saw that he was mummified, his skin dried and leathery, his eyes sunken. But he hadn't decayed in any normal sense. He'd just been preserved, like everything else in this place. A terrible understanding was beginning to dawn on Carl. This rest stop was a trap, a place that existed outside normal time and space. Travelers stopped here, maybe because they needed to rest or had vehicle problems, and they never left. They became part of the place, frozen in the moment they arrived, gradually preserved as the years or decades or centuries passed in some other dimension. While here, in this pocket of strangeness, time stood still. Carl ran from vehicle to vehicle, counting them. There were 17 in total, spanning from the 1950s to what looked like the early 2000s. That meant at least 17 people had been trapped here over the years. Maybe more, if some of the vehicles had carried multiple passengers. He looked for more recent vehicles, hoping to find another driver who might have arrived recently and still be capable of movement or thought. But the newest vehicle was a car from 2003, and its occupant was as frozen as all the others. "Think," Carl said aloud, his voice sounding too loud in the unnatural quiet of the rest stop. "There has to be a way out. People don't just disappear without a trace. There must be records of missing persons, investigations. Why hasn't anyone found this place?" The answer came to him with chilling clarity. Because the rest stop wasn't really here. It existed in some liminal space, a bubble of wrongness that normal people and normal searches would pass right by. You could only find it if you were unlucky enough, or if something about you or your circumstances made you vulnerable to its pull. Carl had stopped because of engine trouble. How many of these other victims had stopped for similar reasons? Mechanical problems, fatigue, the need for a bathroom break. Small, ordinary necessities that had doomed them. Carl walked back to the front of the rest stop building and sat on one of the picnic tables, trying to think of a solution. His engineering mind, honed by years of troubleshooting truck problems and navigating complex routes, refused to accept that there was no way out. Every system had vulnerabilities. Every trap had a weakness. He just had to find it. He thought about the older vehicles versus the newer ones. The vintage cars and trucks were frozen in time from decades ago, but the more recent vehicles were also frozen, just from more recent times. The rest stop was collecting victims across time, pulling them in from different eras. That suggested some kind of temporal anomaly, a place where different times intersected. If time worked differently here, maybe space did too. Maybe the rest stop existed simultaneously on multiple versions of the highway, past and present, and possibly future. Carl stood and walked to the road, looking both ways. The highway stretched into darkness in both directions, looking completely normal. He tried walking down the road, away from the rest stop, but after about 20 feet, he felt a resistance, like trying to push through an invisible membrane. Beyond that barrier, the road seemed to blur and shift, becoming insubstantial. Carl returned to the rest stop and tried a different approach. He climbed back into his original parking spot, the one where his truck had disappeared, and stood there, trying to visualize his rig. He closed his eyes and thought about every detail of his truck, the feel of the steering wheel, the sound of the engine, the smell of the cab. He imagined himself climbing into it, turning the key, pulling out of the rest stop. When he opened his eyes, his truck was back. It sat exactly where he'd parked it, solid and real. Carl didn't hesitate. He ran to the cab, pulled himself inside, and turned the key. The engine started immediately, the temperature gauge showing normal readings. He didn't question how or why. He just threw the truck into gear and accelerated toward the exit. The frozen figures around the rest stop turned to watch him as he drove past. Their heads swiveled in perfect unison, their eyes tracking his movement. The family at the picnic table stood up. The older man by the RV stepped forward. The woman at the information board reached out a hand toward him, but they didn't move quickly enough. Carl's truck roared past them and onto the highway, leaving the rest stop behind. He drove for 10 minutes at maximum speed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look in his mirrors. Finally, he saw lights in the distance, the blessed glow of a real town. Carl eased up on the accelerator as he passed a road sign that welcomed him to Vaughan, New Mexico. Population 442. He pulled into a gas station, the first business he saw, and parked under the bright fluorescent lights. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold his phone when he checked the time. 9:47 p.m., August 3rd. He'd lost only about 30 minutes, though it had felt like hours. His fuel gauge showed a slight drop consistent with the miles he'd driven. Everything was normal, except for the memory of what he'd experienced. Carl didn't finish his run to Albuquerque that night. He called dispatch and told them he was taking a personal day, citing family emergency. He got a motel room in Vaughn and sat awake all night with the lights on, unable to shake the image of those frozen figures turning to watch him leave. In the morning, he drove back toward the rest area, telling himself he needed to confirm it was real, that he hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. He found mile marker 164. There was no rest area there, just empty desert and highway. Carl stopped his truck on the shoulder and got out, walking to where the rest stop should have been. There was nothing, no trace of buildings or parking areas or vehicles, just sand and scrub brush. He searched for an hour, walking back and forth along the highway, but found no evidence that a rest area had ever existed there. Carl finished his delivery to Albuquerque late and took a financial hit for the delay. He never told anyone about the last rest stop, knowing how it would sound. But he researched missing persons cases from New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada, looking for truckers and travelers who disappeared without a trace over the decades. He found more than he expected, dozens of people who'd simply vanished while driving through the Southwest. Not all of them, probably not even most of them, had stopped at the rest area. But some of them, Carl was certain, had made that fatal decision to pull over and rest. He kept driving, but something had changed in him. Carl was more cautious now, more aware that the roads held secrets and dangers that most people never encountered. He avoided stopping at isolated rest areas, especially at night. He kept his truck maintained meticulously, paranoid about any mechanical issue that might force him to pull over in the wrong place at the wrong time. And sometimes, when he was driving through empty desert under a star-filled sky, he'd see a rest area ahead and feel a chill run through him, wondering if this was the one, if this was where the road would finally claim him. But so far, knock on wood, every rest stop he'd passed had been normal, filled with living people and real time. So far, he'd managed to avoid the last rest stop's pull. But Carl knew it was out there somewhere, waiting patiently for its next visitor, ready to add another vehicle and another frozen soul to its collection. Story 6. The Echo Highway. Robert Dalton had been running long-haul routes for 18 years, most of them solo trips across the vast expanses of the Great Plains. On May the 2nd, 2017, he picked up a load of agricultural equipment in Kansas City, bound for Billings, Montana. It was a familiar route, one Robert had driven at least 50 times over his career. The weather was clear, his truck was running well, and he was looking forward to a straightforward, uneventful run. He left Kansas City at 7 a.m., planning to drive straight through with only minimal stops for fuel and rest. The first day went exactly according to plan. Robert made excellent time through Kansas and into Nebraska, stopping only twice for fuel and a quick dinner. He crossed into South Dakota around midnight, planning to drive through the night to make up time. Traffic was light, as expected for a Tuesday night in early May, and Robert settled into the meditative rhythm of night driving that he'd always found relaxing. Around 2:30 a.m., somewhere on I-29 north of Sioux Falls, Robert heard something odd on his CB radio. It was his own voice. Not similar to his voice, but exactly his voice, speaking words he'd said earlier. "This is Lone Wolf on 29 northbound, looking for a radio check near Brookings." Those were the exact words he'd spoken an hour ago when checking in with other drivers in the area. Robert frowned and grabbed his CB mic. "This is Lone Wolf. Somebody playing a recording on the radio. That's not funny, folks." Static answered him, and then his voice again, repeating the same phrase. "This is Lone Wolf on 29 northbound, looking for a radio check near Brookings." A chill ran through him. This wasn't just someone playing a prank. The timing was too perfect, and the quality of the recording was too clean. It sounded exactly like him speaking in real time, not a recorded playback. Robert switched CB channels, but on every frequency he heard the same thing, his own voice echoing back to him with a slight delay. He tried speaking again. "This is Lone Wolf. If you can hear me, respond." 3 seconds later, his words came back to him from the CB speaker. "This is Lone Wolf. If you can hear me, respond." It was as if the highway itself was recording everything he said and playing it back after a brief delay. Robert turned off his CB, disturbed by the phenomenon. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric condition. Radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere in a weird way. He'd heard of strange propagation effects before. Distant stations coming in clearly due to atmospheric ducting. Signals traveling thousands of miles. But having his own transmissions echoed back to him was new and unsettling. He tried to dismiss it and focus on driving. But a few minutes later, he heard something else. The sound of his own truck. It was faint at first, just barely audible over his engine noise. But it was unmistakably the specific rumble and rhythm of his Peterbilt's diesel engine. Robert looked in his mirrors, expecting to see another truck behind him. But the highway was empty. The sound was coming from ahead of him, growing slightly louder as he drove. Robert's unease deepened. He checked his instruments, worried that he was hearing engine problems and misidentifying the location of the sound. But everything looked normal. Engine temperature was good. Oil pressure was solid. All warning lights were off. The sound wasn't coming from his truck. It was coming from somewhere ahead on the highway, and it was definitely the sound of his engine. He drove for another 10 minutes, and the sound got louder. Now he could hear other details, the specific rattle of his trailer hitch, the whine of his air brakes when he'd tap them to adjust speed. Every sound his truck made was being echoed back to him from up ahead, as if another identical truck was driving the same route, just out of sight. Robert's rational mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe there was another driver with the same model truck, traveling the same route at nearly the same speed. The odds were astronomical, but possible. He accelerated, pushing his speed up to 75 miles per hour, trying to catch up to whoever was ahead of him. The sound stayed constant, always just ahead, never getting closer or farther away, no matter how much he varied his speed. Around 3:15 a.m., Robert saw lights in the distance. Not the lights of a truck, but something else. A strange phosphorescent glow that seemed to hover over the highway. As he got closer, the glow resolved into a more defined shape. It was a truck, or the outline of one. Robert could see the silhouette of a cab and trailer, but instead of being solid, it was translucent, made of that same ghostly light. The phantom truck was maintaining a steady speed about a quarter mile ahead of him. Robert could see through it to the highway beyond, could see the stars shining through its translucent form. But the shape was unmistakable. It was his truck. The proportions were identical. The profile was the same. Even the details like the positioning of lights and the style of the trailer matched his own rig perfectly. Robert slowed down, not wanting to get any closer to the apparition. But as he decelerated, the phantom truck slowed as well, maintaining that constant distance between them. When he sped up, it sped up. When he changed lanes, it changed lanes. It was mirroring his every move, or perhaps he was mirroring its moves. It was impossible to tell which of them was the original and which was the echo. The highway had become completely empty, except for Robert and his phantom twin. No other vehicles appeared in either direction. No lights from distant towns broke the darkness. It was as if the world had contracted to just this stretch of I-29, and the two trucks, one solid and one spectral, traveling north in perfect synchronization. Robert tried to break the pattern. He pulled onto the shoulder and came to a complete stop. The phantom truck did the same, pulling over ahead of him and stopping. Robert sat there for a full minute, his engine idling, watching the ghostly outline shimmer in the darkness. Then he started moving again, pulling back onto the highway. The phantom truck pulled out at exactly the same moment. "What do you want?" Robert shouted at his windshield, his voice echoing in the cab. "Why are you following me?" No answer came, but a few seconds later, he heard his own words coming from the CB speaker, even though he'd turned the radio off. "What do you want? Why are you following me?" The CB was repeating everything, even sounds that hadn't been transmitted through it. Robert realized with growing horror that everything about him was being echoed. His voice, his truck, his movements. All of it was being duplicated and reflected back at him. The echo highway, he thought. I'm on some kind of echo highway, where everything repeats. But that didn't explain what was happening or how to stop it. He drove for another hour in this nightmare synchronization with his phantom twin. The horizon began to lighten with the approach of dawn, but the sun didn't rise. The sky grew slightly brighter, but remained dark, as if dawn was frozen at some perpetual pre-sunrise state. Robert's sense of time began to slip. His clock showed 4:45 a.m., but it felt like he'd been driving for days. Then he noticed something new in his mirrors. Another phantom truck was behind him now. This one also made of that translucent light. It maintained the same distance behind him that the forward truck kept ahead of him. Robert was sandwiched between two echoes of himself, trapped in a convoy of ghosts. More trucks appeared one after another, until Robert counted 5 phantom trucks ahead of him and 5 behind. They were all identical to his rig, all translucent, all moving in perfect synchronization. The sight was mesmerizing and terrifying. Robert felt like he was at the center of some infinite regression. A single point duplicated endlessly in both directions. His fuel gauge caught his attention. It was dropping much faster than it should have been. He'd started the night with 3/4 of a tank, enough for at least 400 miles. But now, after what his odometer said was only 70 miles of driving, the gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining. The phantom trucks were somehow draining his fuel, or maybe time was passing differently than his instruments indicated. Robert knew he had to find a way out of this before he ran out of fuel. Being stranded on the Echo Highway, surrounded by ghostly duplicates of himself, was a fate he couldn't contemplate without his mind threatening to shut down completely. He tried everything he could think of: sudden lane changes, rapid acceleration and deceleration, even driving in reverse for a short distance. Nothing broke the pattern. The phantom trucks matched him, move for move. In desperation, Robert grabbed his CB mic and started talking. My name is Robert Dalton. I've been driving for 18 years. I have a wife named Jennifer and 2 daughters, Amy and Sarah. I live in Council Bluffs, Iowa. I'm a real person, not an echo. I'm the original, not the copy. He repeated this litany of identity, affirming his existence against the duplicates that surrounded him. 3 seconds after he spoke each phrase, it came back to him from the CB. My name is Robert Dalton. I've been driving for 18 years. I have a wife named Jennifer. But this time, the voice was different. It wasn't exactly his voice anymore. It had taken on a hollow, distant quality, as if coming from somewhere very far away. Robert continued talking, faster now, not giving the echo time to fully repeat his words before he started the next phrase. He talked about his childhood, his first truck, his favorite routes, anything and everything that made him uniquely himself. The echo tried to keep up, but it began to lag, the delay growing from 3 seconds to 5 to 10. The phantom trucks ahead of him started to flicker and fade. I'm real, Robert shouted. I'm the original. You're just copies, just echoes. You don't have substance. You don't have history. You're just reflections. The phantom truck immediately ahead of him vanished completely. Then the next one disappeared. One by one, the ghostly duplicates winked out of existence as Robert asserted his reality against their emptiness. Finally, all the phantom trucks were gone. The highway was empty except for Robert's solid, real truck. The sky completed its interrupted sunrise, the sun breaking over the horizon in a rush of golden light. Robert's fuel gauge stopped dropping and held steady. His CB went silent, except for the normal static and occasional chatter from other drivers. He checked his GPS, which had been frozen during the echo phenomenon, and it came back to life, showing him on I-29 in South Dakota, exactly where he should be. A wave of exhaustion hit Robert so hard, he almost swerved off the road. He pulled into a rest area at mile marker 213, parked, and sat with his head in his hands. He'd been on the Echo Highway for what his instruments said was 2 hours, but what had felt like an eternity. The experience had drained something fundamental from him. Not just his energy, but some essential quality of selfhood that he'd had to assert and defend against the duplicating force of that strange stretch of road. Robert slept in his cab for 4 hours, ignoring his delivery schedule. When he woke, he checked himself carefully in the mirror, half afraid he'd see some translucent quality in his reflection, some sign that he'd become an echo of himself. But he looked normal, tired and shaken, but solid and real. He finished his run to Billings, arriving 12 hours late. He made up a story about mechanical problems that his dispatcher accepted without question. Robert never told anyone about the Echo Highway, but he researched it obsessively for weeks afterward. He found scattered reports online, vague accounts from other drivers about seeing phantom vehicles or hearing their own voices echoed back to them on empty stretches of highway. Most of the accounts were dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucinations or pranks, but Robert knew differently. He continued driving, but something had changed. Robert became acutely aware of his own existence in a way he'd never been before. He paid attention to the unique details of his life, the specific memories and experiences that made him who he was. And whenever he drove through empty stretches of highway, late at night, he'd talk to himself, maintaining a constant stream of personal narrative. It was a talisman against the echo, a way of asserting his reality against any force that might try to duplicate or replace him. Years later, Robert would tell his daughters about the importance of knowing who you are, of having a strong sense of self. They thought he was just being philosophical, offering fatherly wisdom. They didn't know he was passing on a survival lesson, teaching them how to defend their identity against forces that wanted to copy it, echo it, and ultimately replace it. Because Robert had learned the hard way that on certain roads, under certain conditions, the world tried to duplicate you. And if you couldn't prove you were the original, couldn't assert your unique reality against the copies, you might find yourself becoming the echo instead of the voice. That was a fate Robert had narrowly escaped, and one he'd spend the rest of his life making sure he never faced again. Story 7. The Final Delivery. Victor Reyes had been driving for Continental Shipping for 21 years when he received the strangest delivery assignment of his career. It came through on September 17th, 2021, transmitted not through the usual digital dispatch system, but via a phone call from someone who identified himself as a company executive Victor had never heard of. The man's voice had a peculiar quality, slightly distorted, as if the connection was poor, even though the line was perfectly clear. "Mr. Reyes, you've been selected for a special delivery," the voice said. "This is a priority shipment that requires a driver with your level of experience and discretion. You'll be picking up the cargo at our facility in Gary, Indiana, and delivering it to coordinates in northern Minnesota. The delivery must be completed between midnight and 4 a.m. on September 19th. Is this assignment acceptable to you?" Victor hesitated. Something about the request felt off. What kind of cargo are we talking about? And why the specific time window? I usually don't do time deliveries in the middle of the night, unless it's temperature sensitive or medical supplies. The cargo is specialized equipment. The time window is critical due to the nature of the recipient's work. You'll be compensated at triple your normal rate. All expenses paid, plus a $10,000 bonus upon successful delivery. The coordinates and further instructions are being sent to your phone now. Victor heard the notification chime on his phone. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a text message with GPS coordinates and a pickup time of 6 p.m. on September 18th. The money was too good to refuse, especially with his daughter's college tuition due next month. "All right, I'll do it, but I'll need the standard paperwork, bill of lading, all that. Everything will be provided at pickup. Thank you, Mr. Reyes. This delivery is very important." The line went dead before Victor could ask any more questions. He arrived at the Gary facility at 5:45 p.m. on September 18th. The address led him to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city, a cluster of warehouses that looked mostly abandoned. The specific building was at the end of a dead-end street, its exterior showing no company name or identifying marks. Victor backed his trailer up to the loading dock as instructed, and 3 men in gray coveralls emerged to load the cargo. The cargo consisted of a single container, about 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 5 feet tall. It was made of black metal with no visible seams or openings, and it was covered in symbols that Victor didn't recognize. They looked almost like circuit diagrams, but organic somehow, flowing and interconnected in ways that hurt to look at for too long. The container was loaded onto his trailer with a forklift and secured with heavy chains. One of the men handed Victor a manila envelope. "Your paperwork and payment. Follow the GPS coordinates exactly. Do not deviate from the route. Do not stop except for fuel. Do not attempt to open the container. Upon reaching the coordinates at the specified time, park and wait. The recipient will take possession of the cargo. Your job will be complete." Victor opened the envelope and found a bill of lading that listed the cargo as specialized equipment and the recipient as Northern Research Collective. There was also a cashier's check for $15,000, half his payment. What happens if I'm late? What if there's traffic or weather? Delays? The man stared at him with eyes that seemed slightly wrong, the pupils too large or too dark. "Do not be late. It is essential that the delivery occur within the specified window. Essential." He turned and walked back into the warehouse with the others, and the loading dock door closed with a finality that made Victor shiver. Victor checked the container one more time, ensuring it was properly secured, and pulled out of the facility at 6:23 p.m. The drive to northern Minnesota would take approximately 10 hours, giving him plenty of buffer time to arrive before the midnight deadline. He merged onto I-90 and headed east, planning to cut north through Wisconsin. The first few hours were uneventful. Victor made good time through the evening traffic around Chicago and crossed into Wisconsin around 9 p.m. He stopped once for fuel and a quick bathroom break, the whole stop taking less than 15 minutes. The clerk at the truck stop gave him a strange look as he was leaving, and Victor realized the man was staring at his trailer. "That's an unusual load you've got there," the clerk said. "What is that thing?" Victor glanced back at his trailer, visible through the store's windows. "Just equipment. Why?" "It's humming. You hear that? Like a generator or something running." The clerk tilted his head, listening. Victor listened carefully. He didn't hear anything unusual, just the normal ambient noise of the truck stop. "I don't hear it. Maybe you're picking up sound from another truck." The clerk shrugged. "Maybe. Weird, though. Felt like it was vibrating in my teeth." Victor left quickly after that, disturbed by the comment. He walked around his trailer before climbing back into his cab, checking the container. It looked the same as before, black and featureless, covered in those strange symbols. He put his hand on the metal surface. It was cold, much colder than it should have been after sitting in his unrefrigerated trailer all evening. And there was a vibration, subtle but definitely present, like touching a speaker, playing a very low-frequency sound. Victor climbed back into his cab and continued north. He tried to dismiss his unease, told himself he was just reacting to the strangeness of the pickup and the clerk's comment. But as he drove, he became increasingly aware of the cargo behind him. He could feel it, a presence that seemed to press against the back of his mind. It wasn't just weight and mass back there. It was something else, something that had awareness or intent or both. Around 11 p.m., Victor's CB radio started acting strangely. Instead of the usual chatter and static, he was picking up something that sounded like Morse code, rapid beeps and tones that followed no pattern he recognized. He switched channels, but the sound continued on every frequency. His regular AM/FM radio was doing the same thing, every station broadcasting those same rhythmic pulses. He turned off the radios, but the sound continued, now coming from somewhere in the cab itself. Victor realized with a chill that it was coming from behind him, from the cargo. The container was broadcasting something, a signal that was overwhelming his electronics. His GPS started glitching, the screen flickering between his current location and random points scattered across the globe. His phone showed full bars, but couldn't complete any calls. "What the hell did I agree to haul?" Victor muttered. He considered pulling over, abandoning the load, and dealing with the consequences later. But he thought about that $15,000 check, about his daughter's tuition, about the promise of another $15,000 upon delivery. He kept driving. The route took him onto increasingly remote highways, through the forests of northern Wisconsin and into Minnesota. Traffic disappeared completely. The small towns became farther apart, their lights fewer and dimmer. Victor felt like he was driving into emptiness, leaving the populated world behind with every mile. At 11:47 p.m., he crossed into the Superior National Forest, and the world changed. The trees on either side of the road seemed taller, darker, their branches reaching over the highway like grasping hands. The sky overhead was completely black, no stars visible despite the clear weather. His headlights seemed to penetrate the darkness less effectively, creating a smaller bubble of visibility around his truck. The coordinates led him off the main highway onto a Forest Service road. Victor checked his GPS repeatedly, confirming that this was indeed the correct route. The road was barely wide enough for his truck, branches scraping against his trailer as he navigated the twisting path. He drove for another 20 minutes into the depths of the forest before the road opened into a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a structure. It was hard to look at directly. The angles were wrong somehow, seeming to shift and change depending on where he focused his eyes. It might have been a building or a machine or something in between. Lights glowed from within it, but they were the wrong colors, shades that Victor didn't have names for, hues that shouldn't exist in the normal visible spectrum. A group of figures stood near the structure. They were humanoid, but not quite human, their proportions slightly off, their movements too fluid or too rigid depending on the moment. As Victor parked his truck in the clearing, they turned to face him in perfect unison. Victor sat frozen in his cab, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. Every instinct screamed at him to throw the truck in reverse and get out of there. But he'd come this far, and some part of him needed to see this through to whatever end awaited. He checked his clock. 12:03 a.m., September 19th. He was within the delivery window. One of the figures approached his cab. Up close, Victor could see that it wore something that resembled human clothing, but the material was wrong, too smooth, too uniform, as if it was part of the being's body rather than separate garments. The face was almost human, with 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, but the features were too symmetrical, too perfect, like a computer-generated image of an idealized person. "Victor Reyes," the figure said, its voice having the same distorted quality as the phone call that had started this job. "You have completed the delivery. The container, please." "Who are you people? What is this place?" Victor's voice came out hoarse and shaky. "We are the recipients. This place is where we work. The container is essential to our work. Time is limited. Please allow us to retrieve it." Victor climbed out of his cab, his legs unsteady. He walked to the back of his trailer and unlocked the doors, swinging them open. The figures moved past him with gliding steps, unloading the container with their bare hands, even though it must have weighed several hundred pounds. They carried it toward the structure, and as they approached, an opening appeared in the wall. Or perhaps it had always been there, and Victor just hadn't been able to see it. The figure who had spoken to Victor handed him another envelope. "Your payment. The transaction is complete. You may leave now." There was something in its tone, not quite urgency, but an expectation of immediate compliance. "What's in the container? What are you going to do with it?" The figure's too-perfect face tilted slightly, an approximation of human curiosity. "You do not want to know. Some knowledge is dangerous to possess. You have been fortunate in your ignorance. Maintain it. Leave now, and do not return to these coordinates. Do not speak of this place or this delivery. Do not try to understand what you have seen. These instructions are for your protection." Victor backed toward his cab, unable to take his eyes off the figures as they carried the container into the structure. The opening closed behind them, or perhaps it had never existed. He climbed into his cab, closed the door, and started his engine. As he began to turn around in the clearing, he made the mistake of looking in his mirrors. The structure was opening. Not a door or a window, but the whole thing was opening like a flower, blooming in fast motion. Inside was something vast, something that shouldn't fit within the relatively small structure. Victor saw geometries that folded in on themselves, spaces that existed in more dimensions than his eyes could process, colors and shapes that made his brain hurt as it tried to interpret the impossible images. And at the center of it all, barely visible through the layers of warped space, was the container. It was open now, and something was emerging from it. Victor couldn't tell what it was. His mind simply refused to form a coherent image of the thing. It was large and small simultaneously, organic and mechanical, beautiful and hideous. It pulsed with a light that seemed to come from a spectrum beyond what human eyes were designed to perceive. Victor looked away before his mind could break completely. He focused on the road ahead and drove out of the clearing as fast as the narrow Forest Service road would allow. Behind him, the structure, the figures, and whatever was emerging from that container receded into the darkness. He didn't look back again. The drive out of the forest seemed to take hours, though his clock insisted only 40 minutes had passed. The trees gradually became normal again, their angles conforming to natural geometry. The sky lightened as dawn approached, stars appearing overhead in familiar constellations. Victor's electronics began working properly again, his GPS showing his location, his phone connecting to the cellular network. He found a highway and drove south, putting as much distance as possible between himself and those coordinates in northern Minnesota. Around 7 a.m., exhausted and shaken, he pulled into a truck stop and checked the envelope he'd been given. It contained a cashier's check for $15,000, completing his payment. There was also a note, handwritten in perfect, too regular script. "Thank you for your service. The delivery was successful. Do not return. Do not investigate. Forget." Victor tried to follow that advice. He deposited the check, which cleared without issue. He told his dispatcher that the delivery had been completed successfully, and no one asked for additional details. The job simply disappeared from his records, as if it had never existed. His truck showed no signs of having carried the strange cargo. No residual cold, or vibration, or signal interference. But Victor couldn't forget. He researched the coordinates obsessively for weeks, using satellite imagery and topographic maps. The area showed only forest, no structures, no clearings. He called the number that had given him the assignment, but it was disconnected. He tried to find information about Northern Research Collective and came up empty. The organization didn't exist, at least not in any official capacity. 3 months after the delivery, Victor started having dreams. In them, he was back in that clearing, watching the structure open again and again. Each time, he saw a little more of what had emerged from the container, his dreaming mind less constrained by the limitations of waking perception. The thing was vast and ancient and completely alien. It had come from somewhere else, somewhere outside normal space and time, and it had needed that specific delivery at that specific moment to enter this world. Victor realized that he'd been a small part of something much larger, a cosmic event of staggering significance that he couldn't begin to understand. The figures he'd met were facilitators, beings whose job was to manage the arrival of entities like the one in the container. They did this work in remote locations at specific times, following rules and schedules that predated human civilization. And sometimes, when they needed to transport something, they hired unsuspecting drivers, ordinary people who wouldn't ask too many questions as long as the money was good. Victor had been chosen because of his reliability, his experience, his willingness to take the job without excessive curiosity. He'd been the perfect tool for their purpose. 6 months after the delivery, Victor quit Continental Shipping. He told his family he wanted to retire early, that he'd saved enough money and didn't want to spend his remaining years on the road. That was partially true. But the real reason was that he couldn't trust himself not to accept another special delivery if it was offered. Because despite the terror, despite the nightmares, part of him wanted to see that structure again, to glimpse what existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. Victor bought a small house in suburban Ohio and tried to live a quiet life. But on clear nights, when he looked up at the stars, he thought about what else was out there, what other impossible things might exist in the dark spaces between worlds. And he wondered how many other drivers had made similar deliveries, carrying cargo they didn't understand to destinations that shouldn't exist, serving purposes beyond human comprehension. Sometimes his phone would ring late at night, and he'd see an unfamiliar number on the screen. He never answered those calls, afraid of what voice might be on the other end, afraid of what delivery might be offered. Because Victor knew that if he took another job like that, if he saw another glimpse of the vast and incomprehensible reality that lurked behind the everyday world, he might not be able to turn away. He might drive into those dark places and never come back, becoming another mystery, another trucker who disappeared without explanation on some empty stretch of highway. So Victor stayed home, avoided the road, and tried to forget. But he never truly could. Because once you've seen beyond the veil, once you've delivered something from outside to inside, you carry that knowledge forever. It changes you in fundamental ways, making it impossible to see the world as normal, or safe, or comprehensible. Victor had completed his final delivery, but in a sense, the delivery had also completed something in him, transforming him from a simple trucker into a witness to cosmic horror. And that was a burden he'd carry for the rest of his life.